Welcome to the second video on Kate Summerscale's 2016 The Wicked Boy, a part of the Greenwich Detective Fiction series, originally composed for the third-year core course in English Literature at the University of Greenwich, which I'm sure you're very well aware of by now. Now, I promised in the first video on this text that in this second video we'd be covering the postmodern detective. Well, to some extent that is true, but after talking to students, I concluded that you really don't need another video on postmodernism in general, and you certainly don't need a video that places this text in the long series of postmodern detectives that we've had since the 1980s. That would be a fun thing to do, but not really essential to understand The Wicked Boy. Rather, what I concluded was necessary, and also why it's taken much longer than I would have liked to get this video made, to be honest, is to show how The Wicked Boy can be integrated into the underlying concerns of this series of videos. So, not the postmodern detective. We'll start with a brief return to the very first video of the series and start thinking about how what we've learned so far can be added to it. And after that, I'll give you only a very brief summary of how I'm using the term postmodern in this series of videos and how it relates to The Wicked Boy. While in a third video, since I've heard that you prefer shorter videos too, though why you can't just pause, I actually don't know, I'll explore in more detail than what we've done hitherto the concept of the archive and how it relates to The Wicked Boy. And this will lead into a return again to the very first video to think about why we read. I'd ask you in the meantime to look out for the use of the plus sign in this video. As you know very well by now, I'm very concerned to practice what I preach. That is, that reading is not at all an abstract and purely mental set of symbols and letters, but an embodied, physical, material practice. How those symbols, those letters, those numbers, those clues are presented to us is vital, whether on the page or on the screen. Changing the presentation of words can change their meaning. And my use of visuals, like the plus sign, is as much part of my argument as my words. So, to start with where we began, many months, even years ago, it certainly seems like, with these 6 key terms. Watch as they appear in order and listen to the story that connects them, as that will tell you everything that you really need to know if you honestly and seriously reflect on them. Here we go. Are you ready? How the reader plays the game of detection with the text is, if the reader is willing to play the game at all, largely controlled by the text's organization of time. That is, the sequence of one piece of information after another in time, and the emotional sense of nearness, instantaneity to the events described. Plus, you guessed it, the archival resources the reader needs to play the game of detection that the text offers. Now, notice that author is not here. Although I've mentioned authors like Maurice Leblanc, Arthur Conan Doyle, P.D. James, Mary Braddon, have you noticed that I've tended to play their intentions down? And in the case of P.D. James, for example, I ended up by not caring about her conservative vision of gender that, as many critics have told us, she was trying to communicate. My point is that, despite her intentions, the text of An Unsuitable Job for a Woman allows of an alternative reading to all of us who want it, just as the Arsène Lupin story despite its attempt to close down alternative conclusions through its very strict form imposed by the author, allows us to conclude, in fact, that Lupin himself might have been the murderer of Jenny Saphir. I repeat, this series of videos has been pretty rigorous in thinking about how the reader plays the game of detection with the text. And if the reader is willing to play the game at all, it's largely controlled by the text's organization of time, the sequence of one piece of information after another, and the emotional sense of nearness or instantaneity to the events described, plus the archival resources the reader needs to play the game of detection that the text offers. Now, that thinking has underlain all of this course. It constitutes the a priori supposition of its argument. That is, it is the statement from which all else on this course flows, which enables all the thinking on this course, or almost all, since it's also an a priori assumption, though it's not written down here, that we are never fully in control of our thinking or communication. The fiction of detection is precisely that we think we are in control, when the reality is that some of what we do at least, and think, are beyond our control entirely. We can't detect it. In the service of the game of reading, I've also called on a term I learned from study of the works of the French historian and philosopher, or perhaps philosopher of history, Michel Foucault, whom a member of the UK government in December 2020 claimed to be the cause of all our society's ills. Well, how wonderful to be studying someone who has such fantastic power, eh? He sounds like a Marvel supervillain. It's fantastic. Alas, that isn't true. But Foucault is very influential on my thinking, at least. And on this course, this definition of discourse has been important for how we've thought about what games are being played with us and what those games actually are. Remember that discourse, as defined by Foucault, because it's got lots of other meanings as well, discourse is a set of statements that might never openly be uttered, but which nonetheless govern what we think reality is. You can see very, very clearly a battle of discourses in the news at the moment. Has the American election been won or not, for example? For some people, evidence is less important. The discourse of victimhood determines what reality is, much more than evidence. I'm a victim! I've been cheated! Will trump any evidence presented. Reality lies in how you feel. That's a discursive rule of one kind of discourse. Arguing from evidence is another discourse. It assumes reality is anchored externally to us and irrelevant of how any of us feels. Now, that's not to say there's no reality at all, or all claims to reality are equal. The study of discourse absolutely does not claim that. But it does help us to see what's at stake in the games being played by the set texts we've been discussing, because often there's a battle between different discourses that's being fought, and that battle can create a sense of sensation and of nearness, of proximity, of excitement. If it's relevant, if we can key into what those discourses are, which is quite difficult at times with historical texts, but sometimes it's not, as I hope you've discovered already. In the service of the game being played in the set text, two more terms, the law and justice, have also figured from time to time. These to me are connected not just to what game is being played between us and the text, but also the how. It's connected to the ethics of how we play the game of detection, the game of decoding, the game of reading. Think back to An Unsuitable Job for a Woman again, because I know that's a very popular text amongst you. Do we just accept its game that was probably consciously based on discourses concerning the inferiority of women as detectives, as readers? Or can we read the text against the grain, as the saying goes, and read it as the validation, perhaps against the author's intentions, of a form of detection, a form of reading that's not clinically cold, rational, and masculinist, but which is open to using emotion and a feeling of connection, intuition, guesswork, love and neurosis even, to solve mysteries. So we haven't got either feeling or fact. We've got a combination here. Yes, Cordelia fails according to the criteria of Adam Dalgliesh, but is staying within his discourse, his interpretation, the only ethical possibility the text opens to us? Well, I certainly argued otherwise in my video. In other words, how we decode text, how we solve mysteries or fail to solve them, always has an ethical element to it. It involves always a sense of the law. Do we stick to what we think, what other people tell us we should be doing? Or is there an ethical element as well, where we try to think beyond the immediate concerns and claims of what we're told to do into wider social issues? What is good for all of us? Now let's move on to The Wicked Boy. It exists in various editions, in various formats, not just paperback and hardback, but in various forms of paperback, and of course there are the digital editions as well. And one of the ones that I have, the one you can see on the screen, is wonderfully ingenious. I love this one. It takes the O of boy and turns it into a Sherlock Holmes type magnifying glass by cutting up the center and printing a silhouette of Robert Coombs on the next page. So we, the potential readers, are positioned outside the book, looking inside the book through this detective spyglass. That very format places The Wicked Boy in the tradition of Victorian British detective fiction, of course. But there are other possibilities too. The Wicked Boy has been translated into several languages you can find on various book purchasing websites. Now, what do these translations tell us about how readers in their various markets are supposed to understand by this text? Well, I find the French edition quite dull. The title's translated as an unusual boy, un singulier garçon. The mystery of a child matricide in the Victorian era. The blurb just tells the story, and the cover is simply that of the outside of the house. Readers' comments on the French version just show that they understand the text simply as documentary. And I'm not surprised given a cover like this. It's really boring, isn't it? The Italian translation is altogether different. The cover is dramatically different, as you can see. The top's modelled on medieval Italian images of saints threatened by the instruments of their torture in an apse, while the bottom has him hemmed in by representatives of the law. The translation of the title is initially more literal. Il ragazzo cattivo is a literal translation of The Wicked Boy, but the subtitle is very different. Instead of The Mystery of a Victorian Child Murderer in the original, or The Mystery of a Child Matricide in the Victorian era, as in the French, the Italian quite deliberately and explicitly seeks to insert the text first into an archive of high-status 19th century literature. The subtitle is Delitto Castigo, the Italian translation of Dostoevsky's famous 1866 novel about a murderer that we know as Crime and Punishment. Crime and Punishment focuses on the mental anguish and moral dilemmas of Raskolnikov, an impoverished young man in St. Petersburg. Now, he kills an unscrupulous, horrible pawnbroker for her money, telling himself that with this money he could not only liberate himself from poverty, but go on to perform great deeds in the service of others. That, in other words, by murdering the awful pawnbroker, her money can be used to benefit all of society. However, once he's committed the murder, just like Henry Dunbar, which had come out just a few years earlier, remember, Raskolnikov finds himself racked with paranoia and anguished guilt. Now, his ethical justifications to himself for the murder disintegrate completely in the face of his realization of the horror of what he's committed. Yes, exactly like Henry Dunbar, though literary history has extolled the Dostoevsky, raised it to the stars, while until the last 40 years ago, it utterly despised and dismissed Mary Braddon, dismissed her to the gutter. The Italian translation, though, is deliberately connecting the wicked boy not to Henry Dunbar, but to high literary culture, therefore, to the Dostoevsky. And it suggests that the text pursues the same themes of guilt and self-torture and ethical dilemma, the psychological study of Dostoevsky. Does it do that? I'm not entirely sure. You may disagree, but I do wonder how much we get into the head, really, of Robert Coombs. More importantly, I think, look again at the Italian subtitle, for it adds redenzione to delitto castigo, redemption. And note too how the blurb both places the book in the tradition of detective fiction, the giallo, and here's the translation coming up, and also a Christian redemption narrative. The sinner is redeemed. Now, again, this is exactly like Henry Dunbar, but it's quite unlike Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov. I love the hopeful ending of the blurb, though, how the text offers us the story of how one's life can be remade, malgrado tutto il male del mondo, despite all the evil in the world. Isn't that wonderful? There is hope. Now, we don't need to read The Wicked Boy through Christian discourses, but we can, I think, appreciate the importance of this offer of hope to us, especially in these very dark times. The Wicked Boy isn't just a documentary, as the French translation suggests. It's not just a true crime story, but a resource of hope, I think. At least it is to me. And this is the discourse, that literature can act as a resource of hope through which I read it. Do you? It's not for me to say, but I certainly do. Now, I promised you that I'd relate The Wicked Boy to postmodernism, and here it is, all in one slide. In the box on the right I'm presenting to you now, there's everything you need to know. Okay, I know there are countless definitions of postmodernism out there, and they are very, very detailed and very complicated. But this summary is one that at least I find helpful when defining a text as postmodern. And I hope it's one that you'll find helpful too. Although the box says everything, I will go through the terms there just to ensure it's all clear to you. First then, oh, hang on, what's this? Oh, you never seem to be able to control what you think. We're never fully in control. Is the box telling us that postmodernism's just a game? Is it just a silly pastime? Or are there ethical questions at play in postmodernism too? Perhaps we'd better move on. Well, let's look at that first word. The postmodern text is typically polysemous. Well, almost all texts are polysemous in reality, but the postmodern text is openly polysemous. That is, it puts its polysemy on display. It highlights how it, and often other texts, or all texts, can offer more than one interpretation or meaning. It's often a question of intertextuality and references to literary archives. Can The Wicked Boy, for example, be placed in the same Christian tradition as Henry Dunbar, where the criminal is redeemed by divine grace and repentance? Perhaps. I can imagine a reading like that. Can it be related to the great tradition of the Russian novel that explores in detail the psychology and context of its characters, as the Italian blurb suggested? Possibly. Can it be related to the documentary investigation of true crime, like In Cold Blood? Well, yes. Now, those kind of questions about what tradition to place a text in are the norm, of course. And of course, when placed in different traditions, the meaning of a text, or at least the dominant meanings of a text, will change. But The Wicked Boy is at some pains to demonstrate that it's very well aware of this possibility. It's aware of its own polysemy, its own perhaps this or perhaps that. And later on, I'll give you an example, a very short one, a very simple one, but it's a very interesting and significant one. The postmodern text typically stresses that it's not purely just one thing. It may stress that it's not just a novel, it may be a documentary too, maybe an autobiography as well. Maybe it mixes fiction and fact. Again, many texts do that way before the so-called period of postmodernism. Just think of the emphasis that I've placed on proximity in fiction on this course from the 19th century onwards. And isn't it interesting that the critics love to tease out how realistic the smash hit serial fantasy Bridgerton is, both Netflix and paper versions. Some critics care a great deal about how realistic it is and pounce on how the fabrics and clothes, the commonness of BAME people in the upper echelons of British society were at the time. Are they accurate or not? Well, they are and they aren't. Bridgerton, like The Wicked Boy, is postmodern. It's completely normal now. Impurity, a mix of fantasy and fact, a mix of then and now. Well, for some people, they're regarded as aesthetic flaws, and people criticize them for not being perfectly factual or not being entirely fantasy-based. I don't think either Bridgerton or The Wicked Boy cares. Well, actually, I think The Wicked Boy does. I'm not sure Bridgerton does. I think Bridgerton flaunts its hybridity. But The Wicked Boy also flaunts its hybridity, but I think in a pretty serious way. The Wicked Boy mixes fact and speculation. It rearranges timelines for rhetorical effect, as we shall see. It openly declares that it uses the most up-to-date technologies to create its Victorian world, for example. In short, The Wicked Boy is very self-conscious about its own status as a text. It engages openly in questions about what texts can do, what effect texts can have on the extra-textual, on the context. We're so used to thinking about what effects context has on texts that we forget, indeed we're taught to forget, that texts have an effect on context too, and we are part of that context, we readers. The text's effect on us, on readers, is of course at the heart of sensation fiction. Texts were designed to affect us, to affect our bodies, to affect our feelings, our hearts and minds. Now, yes, I know we're taught to keep ourselves out of essays that discuss texts. We've got to be impersonal. Students write to me, Can I use I in my essay? I always say yes. Let's be honest. Isn't our first impulse to write about how a text makes us feel? Texts generate knowledge in conversation with us, yes. But that knowledge, that conversation, isn't only cold and intellectual. It's hot, sweaty, and bodily too. Almost all texts seek to control our bodies as well as our minds. I know from many conversations with students that I'm not at all alone in weeping at the end of The Wicked Boy, even against my conscious will. My body has its own knowledge, its own reaction to the text that's beyond my conscious control. I may be looking consciously for rhetorical strategies of feeling, for the precise play of the hermeneutic cycle, but often my body will take over and I'll just read and react emotionally. The Wicked Boy is very well aware of this mysterious operation of text, how texts operate in such a way that they escape our control. It asks us to reflect on that. It asks us to query our assumptions about what knowledge is. Epistemology is the study of what knowledge is, how we create knowledge. And open epistemological investigation, or at least asking questions about how we construct knowledge, are characteristic of postmodern texts, and we certainly can perceive that in The Wicked Boy. Look at this extract. It raises all the points I've just discussed. It's from one of the most crucial positions in a novel, or indeed in a well-written academic text, a position that sums up a key argument that the whole text is going to make or going to explore. It comes at the very end of the first chapter. Can I suggest that you always pay attention to the end of the first chapter, or at least the first section? Maybe it'll be the end of chapter 2, but certainly the end will be very significant, as well as the beginning. Previously, The Wicked Boy has already laid down the thesis that Robert's reading influenced his actions, that his reading influenced his body. In other words, texts influenced his body. And here, right at the end of the chapter, the text returns to it and halos fact with speculation. The fact has a paragraph all of its own, a very short paragraph of 1 line plus 2 words, 15 short words. Robert asked Fox if he knew the way to India. Fox said that he did. And there follows an imaginative, a sympathetic commentary, almost 8 times as long, that turns those 15 simple words into something magical. It offers them a kind of an inexplicable nimbus, a halo of imaginative hypothesis. The narrator doesn't know that this is what Robert was thinking. She imagines it. She's doing exactly what Edgar Allan Poe said the detective must do in that famous introduction to the murders in the Rue Morgue. Do you remember this? Deprived of ordinary resources, the analyst throws himself into the spirit of his opponent, identifies himself therewith. But there's a marked difference between The Wicked Boys and Poe's method of identification. Poe's is antagonistic. The method of identification has the purpose of seeing at a glance the sole methods, sometimes indeed absurdly simple ones, by which he may seduce the criminal into error or hurry him. Let's face it, Poe was operating in a homosocial world, into miscalculation. Doesn't The Wicked Boy's invitation to the reader to identify with a criminal have an epistemological rather than just a coldly investigative or combative or antagonistic purpose. It asks us to think about the dialogic nature of knowledge, how we form knowledge in conversation with others, with other texts, how the intertextual corpus available to us, the archive available to us, sets limits on what we know, how we know, and crucially, how we behave, what we do. The past haunts the present. It's always here, never entirely there. The archive enables our present and sets limits to it, constantly being modified by the present in a hermeneutic cycle. This isn't just academic reading, it's life. Poe's language may be more obviously philosophical, or at least how we think of philosophy, but Kate Summerscale's undertaking here is equally philosophical, even if she doesn't use phrases like the mental features discoursed of as analytical. The wicked boy may not parade philosophical knowledge, but it is nonetheless founded on pretty rigorous postmodern philosophical principles about the nature of knowledge. Now, I know many of you will associate postmodern texts with difficulty, with rebarbative rhetoric that's deliberately hard to understand. The Wicked Boy doesn't do that. It's been through all that. It knows how to do it and can't be bothered. It rejects the way those high-status art novels mark themselves out as exclusive, even while they play. Yes, the refusal of knowledge organized in binary systems of good versus bad, high versus low, vulgar versus tasteful, past versus present, and of course, writer versus reader. The Wicked Boy includes all of those very carefully, and very carefully refuses to prioritize one over the other. It's careful to allow the reader to make their own decisions, even while the text is so carefully organized. While the text is, in other words, so writerly as to suggest some considerations more than others, it doesn't force certain conclusions. It doesn't oppose what seem opposites, but asks us to think of them conjoined, working cooperatively, each indebted to the other. But that means it raises questions more than it makes definitive assertions about how to interpret things. Let's return to this extract one last time to see how what I'm talking about works in practice. The point of the main paragraph here is the postmodern one of how textuality and reality, two apparently binary opposites, call them fiction and reality if you like, how these apparently binary opposites aren't really opposites at all. They merge into one another, they reinforce one another, they even work in cooperation almost. Rhetorically, the text undermines the sense that reality and fiction are opposites, and it does that in two ways. Echo, hunker down, and the Timothy Topstay with John Fox, and analogy. The analogy is communicated in that important word like, the indicator of simile, a rhetorical strategy, a rhetorical technique that links two often unlikely but certainly different entities. The echo most obviously involves, as you can see from the underlining and the boxes, the repetition of the same phrasal verb hunker down in two parallel clauses, but there are the preceding echoes or mirrorings, which I've underlined. In the last paragraph, it's centre on whose hinges a full stop. A full stop here doesn't operate as an end point. But a linkage. Isn't that curious? Full stop's supposed to end a sentence. Here, it's a kind of sign, a graphic sign that something else is going to come up. That's a parallel. In both cases, fiction and reality are united by a friend of Robert's father, a father substitute. And you could say that paternal absence is the key to the crime here. But where actually is this said? Where is it made clear, explicit, stated in the text? Well, nowhere without hesitation. The writer has written in such a way that the reader is left to make up her own mind what to make of the writing. Both reader and writer are active in making the text. Both reader and writer are active in activating the text. What do we think of this practice, indeed, of the cooperation? The plus sign is not reader versus writer, but reader and writer. Do we care? Are there ethical implications of the game that's being played here? That's being played with us? Or do we think the text is playing on us? Is the text playing rhetorical tricks on us, trying to catch us out as if it were Poe's detective and we the criminal, or indeed vice versa? Or is it asking us to play with it nicely, cooperatively? Well, it would be wrong for me to tell you one way or the other how it is for you. But for me, it's a question of cooperation. You may feel coerced by it. I don't know, and that's fine. But what are the implications, the ethical implications of either position, of playing with or playing on? Will we take serious responsibility for our own reading, our decoding of the mysteries, and then for our own actions based on that? Will we prioritize ourselves, our own feelings, above our interactions with others, or put them in cooperation? I hope the cooperation, the feelings and the logic. But now we're straight into connections with the next video.